From Nashville, Tennessee, Music City, USA, and the home of hot chicken, it's the Rick Altizer Show. Sit back, buckle up. Rick will talk with the movers, shakers, and creators who put Christ in Christian entertainment. He's a man who's clear so the world can hear. Here's Rick Altizer.
Thanks for joining me today. This is Rick Altizer, the host of The Rick Altizer Show, as you heard from Bob Allen. You know, Bob Allen's my friend, he's my buddy, and he's the voice of The Rick Altizer Show. Thanks, Bob, for that wonderful introduction. And today is part 2 of my interview with Rich Peluso. If you missed the first one, you can go to my website, rickaltizer.com, or listen to the podcast, The Rick Altizer Show, on iTunes or anywhere podcasts are played. It will be there. And Rich, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Rick. It's great to be back.
We are here. I'm actually in his home, sitting in his dining room, made me a cup of coffee. We're just having a great conversation, and we're just glad you're here, Rich, and we're glad you're here listening to us. So we did talk a little bit about his job at, he's the executive vice president of Affirm Films for Sony Pictures. Made a few films. You might have been, I don't know, maybe you've heard of War Room or Heaven is for Real or Soul Surfer or Risen or... Anyway, it goes on. The list goes on and on. And we did talk about the new movie that is out in theaters now, Paul, the Apostle of Christ. We talked about that. And again, I encourage you to get the podcast to check that out. And so you were talking about your role at Sony Pictures, at Affirm Films. Script development, financing, production, distribution, and marketing. So it kind of sounds to me like from the beginning to the end, you're kind of involved in, is Control Freak here at all, or is that just the job?
Well, I mean, there's actually a really long involved story about why that is, but I'll give you the short version. I was in Christian music during the growth and the height and the collapse of it. And during that time, collapse, I mean, of the recorded music business, the sales side of it, not the collapse.
Right, because it's the whole music industry had that same collapse.
It had big change, and music is more people are consuming more music now than ever before in history. So music is not collapse; it's just that the traditional business of music. As part of that, I was younger, and I was more. Really focused on outward signs of success. And so I love the idea of building a team and building a kingdom, a fiefdom, and, hiring people and building things. And as music started to collapse, a couple things happened. One is we started to have to feed the machine. Instead of worrying about quality, we just had to start feeding the machine because we built such a big machine. And then as the music business started to slide off, I went through a period of a couple of years of having to lay people off, 100+ people.
Oh, yeah.
And
terrible.
Doing it personally, face-to-face with HR. And one of the things I did when I left the music business is I said to myself, I'm never going to lay off someone again. I'll do everything, everything in my power to never have to lay off anyone again.
Can I interrupt real quick?
Yeah.
Laying off 100 people face-to-face.
Yeah.
What did that do to you?
It was difficult because, a lot of them were local and they're people that I knew and I loved. And I'd see them at church. I'd see them at the store. I'd see them in restaurants. And these are people that are, have mortgages and braces on their kids. And it was difficult. Now, a lot of them, they're great people. All of them were great people and they landed on their feet, but not everyone did. And those were, it just it hurts. And I'm not complaining about me because they went through a more difficult time than I did. But what I decided was I just never wanted to do that again.
Absolutely.
So when I came on board at Sony Pictures, we started 11 years ago with 4 people, with no library and no business, really, Sony taking a chance on us. And 11 years later, we've done over $500 million in theatrical revenue, a multiple of that in terms of home entertainment and television revenue. A very successful business, and we have 4 people.
Still 4?
4 people.
$500 million.
Yeah, in theatrical. That's just one channel of revenue. Now, with each picture that we do, we'll have a team of 20 or 30 independent marketers and consultants that we bring on board.
That you pay as independent consultants.
Around that picture.
But they're not employees.
They're not employees. And
when the picture's over, their job's done, you don't have to lay anybody off.
And they're happy because they go on to another picture. They're doing, these are people that are doing really well. And so that's, that is part of kind of how I'm wired now.
Lean and mean.
Yeah.
Definitely. Well, it's mean. I mean, it's very successful. So we kind of had hinted at this a little bit about partnering with a secular company.
Mm-hmm.
So, can we talk about, because Bill Reeves told, I had him on the show and he was talking about how it's a delivery system like FedEx. FedEx delivers your packages and you don't ask, is it a Christian company that's delivering your packages? And he saw the secular companies as just a delivery system to take our message and delivering it to theaters across the world. So can we talk about just the navigation of doing Christian movies with a company that is not Christian, that has no interest in being Christian? Do you struggle with being unequally yoked? How do you navigate all that?
Well, it is, it's something I've had a lot of experience doing, because when I started at EMI in 1990, we were an independent Christian record company. At the time, I was with Star Song Records, which was owned by Bill Gaither and a few others. And we were acquired by EMI, which is a mainstream company. And we, quickly had to understand how to work with a mainstream company based out of London, no interest in Christianity per se. They just wanted records that sold. And the idea is to try to find, one thing I love doing is using the resources that are available to these mainstream companies in growing the kingdom, in really serving artists and songwriters and now filmmakers that have visions and stories that can grow the kingdom, and being a servant to them and a resource to them to help them realize their visions and their dreams. From Sony, in Affirm Films case, from Sony's perspective, again, they look at it as, hey, if you can find an underserved audience and provide them a product or service they want, and are willing to reward you, for those products, and you run an efficient business that allows you to provide those products at a cost that generates a profit to the company, and then therefore serves the interest of the company in terms of generating profit and providing investor and shareholder return. From Sony's perspective, that's a complete circuit. That's a business. And if you're successful at it, they just want you to do it. And so to me, it's very, it allows us to operate in a way that, can serve these independent filmmakers and directors and writers with their stories, and allows them to sit on top of the global Sony distribution system. So it really is a win-win for everybody.
That's amazing. Alex Kendrick had told me that they don't let anybody communicate the gospel in their movies unless they're a Christian. And I thought that was interesting because, it's acting. It isn't real life, but that was their take on it. And I know that what's your take on that, and why? Because I know Sony doesn't do that.
Right.
Why? And what is your reasoning on that?
Well, I would answer the question this way and say that, the Kendricks have a philosophy and they have a belief system for how they want to run their business. We share a belief system in our Creator. We're all believers, but they want to run their business a certain way. And I wouldn't criticize it one bit, because that is what God is telling them to do. They feel confident that that God is speaking through them in their work and in their how to honor God in their work. And so I celebrate that they do that, and it doesn't bother me one bit. I think there's opportunities for different filmmakers to have different visions for their stories and how they bring those stories to market. And so my personal philosophy is I want the best people in every role. And what I find is that the best people that we're attracting, first and foremost, a lot of them tend to be Christians or have an affinity for the faith or be seekers, and they're really excited to do it. Take Jennifer Garner for instance. She grew up in the church. Her father was a pastor. She'd not been engaged in her faith in decades, and she worked on our film Miracles from Heaven. And while on location in Atlanta, just dealing with the content and the real people in the story, she decided to start going to church on Sundays during production. And then she's re-engaged in her faith. And there was a news story about that.
Praise the Lord.
To me, that's a big win.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? And you wouldn't have that if my philosophy was only Christians can work on our movies. I just want the best actors, the best writers, the best directors. If they're believers, that's a huge bonus. I just want people that are not antagonistic towards the Christian faith, that are open to it or neutral on it, but they're great at their craft. And my hope and my prayer is that through the interaction with the story and the content, that it's going to change them in the same way I want an audience to be changed, engaged in the story.
Because I know there was a movie way back. It wasn't one of your movies, but it was a while ago, and the main actor then later came out and started talking about his sexual orientation, and he was a homosexual, and so he's very vocal about that, and he was a main character in, and so you wonder as an audience, why is that guy playing? When I know where that guy stands, and so. There is in our culture, there's those guys in us, and there is this very much, which God's Not Dead 3 does talk to, but there seems to be this division, red states and blue states, and the flyover. We fly over you. How just the concept of that is so degrading. But there's this division that's happening among us, politically and religious, and just in our whole culture. And so, I'm just concerned as if you get the wrong actor in there one day, does that really come back to bite you? Is that why the Kendrick brothers, I'm just kind of going down this rabbit hole of it with you.
I mean, I think it could. It's a very valid question, and it's a very valid point. And, I tend not to dwell on it because, we do go through a vetting process, with actors and with people on our films. Of course we do. In the same way we don't want, people with criminal behavior or, lots of other things. And so, we're careful, and we want people that want to be part of our stories in our movies, and that we want to be part of our stories and movies. And that process it's not flippant and it's not overnight, so there's a lot of thought that goes into the people that are part of our teams. And, I've had lots of great discussions with people with different philosophies, filmmakers with different philosophies, and I respect all the different kind of views on it. We have our own view, and so far over the last 11 years, we've seen a lot of fruit from that. Not just the success of the films financially, and not just even the lives that have been changed, because we get a lot of emails and a lot of Facebook posts about people whose marriages have been saved, lives have been changed, relationships have been changed. But also, Rick, the personal interactions I've had with actors and filmmakers, directors and writers that were not people of faith, that thought, wow, this is a really touching story, very inspirational story. I mean, take our latest film, Paul, Apostle of Christ. James Faulkner, who plays Paul. He was harmed by the church. When he was 12 years old, he's told the story. When he was 12 years old, he had a very, very problematic interaction with a clergyman. And it's not as terrible as your mind might go to, but it was enough to turn him off to faith.
Yes.
And here we are 50 years later. He gets the offer for this movie, Paul, and reads the Bible for the first time and reads books about Paul. And at the end of the production, he and his wife made a point. They really wanted to have a private dinner with me, because we had lots of dinners together when other actors and other people around, at the end of the day. He said, no, look, my wife and I, we want to go just with you, because I need to talk to you. So we have dinner, and he starts telling me his story about what happened with him at church and why he's not been at church, and how who Paul is and what he wrote and what the scripture is causing him to rethink his entire life.
Praise the Lord.
And he asked questions like, isn't it too late for me? All the things I've done. I'm like, no, Paul. I call him Paul. I'm like, no, James, let me tell you the essence of the gospel. Let me tell you the parable of the workers in the field. That is exactly the question you have about, is it too late? And those kinds of conversations, I don't have the opportunity to have with Christians. This is the opportunity to share my faith in a professional, vocational environment.
And when you see the movie, it's in theaters now, Paul the Apostle of Christ. The gospel is just front and center. It is so, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful film. And as I said last week, the best ending of any movie I've ever seen. I mean, I think I just am not aware of an ending that affected me emotionally more than. I'm not going to give it away. I'm just going to say I recommend it highly. I just thought it was great. And I think Christians, I have to be careful what I say because it's public radio and not some of these stations are public. But I just really, really recommend this movie. And it was beautiful. It was beautiful.
Well, thanks. So one of my favorite kinds of endings to a movie is when in the last few minutes you have that big aha moment. You put two and two together in the movie and you say, that's what that all meant. And I think Paul does a really good job. The movie Paul does a really good job of doing that.
Yes, it's made well. You're listening to the Rick Altizer Show on Bot Radio. And my guest today is Rich Peluso from Affirm Films, Sony Pictures. We're talking about movie making and we're talking about all kinds of things. So this is going to be way off the. How did you get into music? How did you get in the music industry?
Well, there are 3 times in my life so far where God has just kind of grabbed me by the throat, really made himself very real, very present in my life. One is a very long and involved story about about one of my daughters who almost died when she was an infant, and through what some would call amazing, unearthly of coincidence, which I know to have been providence, I know have been God's hand, her life was spared. The other 2 times that God has really shown up have been vocational. So when I got into the music business, I grew up playing music. I was in a high school band, played parties, and I wrote songs and recorded stuff at home on my dad's reel-to-reel. And, the only brush with fame that I had as a high school band was that my girlfriend, who is now my wife in high school, my girlfriend, Michelle, she dated me, but she also liked and sort of dated this guitar player from our rival high school, a guy named Mark. And we beat Mark's band in the Battle of the Bands, and that band became Hootie and the Blowfish. Now, they didn't meet Darius Rucker until college, but that's the closest I ever came to fame, all right, in the music side. So, but anyways, I got into the music business through an amazing thing that happened where I stumbled into it. I found a help wanted ad because I was bored and I wanted to read the paper, and it was a 3-week-old paper. And I read it, and it said a Christian music company was looking for a sales rep and call this number. And I was living in Washington, D.C. With my wife, and I called the number, and it turned out to be Star Song Records in Nashville, Tennessee. And the sales manager was flying to D.C. the next day and had one opening for an interview. I showed up. I was so excited, I said, I'll be there, and I didn't tell him my name or anything. And it was a payphone back then because we didn't have cell phones, right? I was in the car waiting for my wife. And I called the number and talked to the guy, and I said, I'll be there. So I show up, and I didn't know his name. He didn't know my name. I sat in the lobby all day from about 8 in the morning until 5 at night. And they didn't, I'm sure he had forgotten the conversation because I hung up so abruptly. I was so excited. And it wasn't until about 5, maybe it was 5:30, 2 guys came out of the elevator with Star Song jackets on going into the hotel restaurant to have dinner. And I ran up and approached them and told him who I was, and the guy's like, "Oh yeah, you called yesterday. I totally forgot."
Was that Wayne and Darryl?
No, it was a guy named Laren Philpott and Steve Reno.
Okay.
And so they said, "Have dinner with us." So a 30-minute interview got turned into a dinner.
Right.
By the end of dinner, they offered me the job.
Oh, praise the Lord.
With a condition, because they had hired a guy before me for that territory, but they said, "We'll hire you, but we need to move you up to New York to take that territory." Here's the twist. I never told my wife I went for the interview. I called in sick for my job to go to the interview. So then I have to come home and tell my wife, I went to an interview, I got the job, and we're moving to New York.
To New York.
That's how I got in the music business. And I was there for 15 years. And when I left, I started a small children's, there's a woman by the name of Julie Clark who created Baby Einstein brand, sold it to Disney, Her and a guy named John Walsh, who started America's Most Wanted, started a little kids company. They brought me on board to help them run it. We sold the rights to Sony Pictures for the DVD distribution. And I developed a relationship with one guy there for the business transaction, but then we became friends. And a year later is when he called me after Sony had, in our previous interview, Sony had acquired this little church-made movie, and it did really well. And they decided to start a company.
I was Facing the Giants.
Facing the Giants. And this guy, Steve Oken, who remains a dear friend of mine today, Steve called me up and said, Sony decided they wanted to get into this business. I'm Jewish, and you're the only Christian I know. Will you fly out here and help me understand this business so that I can make a business case? So I came out there, met with him, met with some other people, flew back home. It was just a favor to a friend. And then he called me the next day and said, the meeting went really well. They want you to come run it. That's how I ended up at Sony Pictures. Completely, I wasn't looking for that job. I didn't want the job. I wasn't in the film business.
Yeah.
And suddenly they said, we want you to come run this film studio.
Isn't that interesting how God...
It really is amazing.
Talk about film. John Erna was telling me this week, he said the same demographic of kids who are leaving the church, it's the same people going to movie theaters. That group of people leaving the church are leaving the church and literally going to the movies. Talk about the opportunity to communicate the gospel through movies.
Well, look, John loves statistics. He loves research, and I love that about him because I'm a data guy as well. However, in this area, I tend to not try to explain a lot of, or try to figure out a lot of those things about church attendance or why people may or may not be turning away from the church. Because I'm in a space where I'm running into a lot of people who are discovering the church and are coming into the church. So I'm dwelling and focused on that part of it. But I will say this, Rick, in terms of the ability and the power of films to spread the gospel or impact lives, I can just point to Jesus. And what Jesus said one time when his disciples came up to him and said, hey, I'm paraphrasing, right? Hey, dude, why are you always telling stories? And Jesus responded, you know what? You're blessed in that you have discernment and you understand the kingdom of God. But these stories are for people who don't. And they illuminate and they enlighten. What's interesting is if you look back at the stories Jesus told, my view is he told them in 3 acts, just like a film. And also, he didn't tell faith-based stories. He told stories about vineyards and workers and people in the field. He told these stories about a father who had a troubled son and who left him. And, these stories were stories that were relevant and identified with people and pointed them towards the truths of the kingdom of God. And if Jesus was primarily, in his ministry in communicating with unbelievers, I wouldn't say primarily, but a key part of how he communicated was in storytelling, then I think it's a great thing to model and to go after in terms of telling stories, which is, I think, a great example of how stories, whether it's through film or music or books, can impact hearts and change lives. John
told me that T.D. Jakes said that if Jesus was alive, he'd be a movie filmmaker.
Yeah, he'd be a filmmaker and he'd be an author and he'd be a songwriter.
So pretty much, most of the best Christian films you've been involved with, since this fledgling industry has started. So just how much do you love your job?
That's such an interesting question. I love my job only as long as I have a project in my hands that I really believe in. There are a lot of people in this business that, were making films when they were 8 years old with their dad's camera or something, right? I wasn't that guy. I mean, I was writing songs, but for me, it's about story, okay? And so I love my job right now because I've got projects that are in my hands I believe God has directed us towards, and I want to do it. And the moment that dries up, I'm on to something else. So yes, I love my job, but more importantly, I love the stories, and I love the storytellers I get to work with.
I'll tell you what I love. I love interviewing you. This has been great. We've done 2 interviews, and it seemed like 10 minutes to me, just to me. The only other guy Steve Taylor, I did 3 interviews with him.
What an awesome guy. I love Steve.
So we did one interview was music. It was each decade.
Yeah.
Every decade he reinvents himself. So we had the 80s music,
Yeah.
90s producer, and 2000s filmmaker.
Yeah.
So we had a different interview for each decade of Steve
That's
Taylor's
really
life.
cool. I get to work with him still to this day. I'm on a board on Lipscomb University, and I get
Yes.
to interact with him.
So, Rich, I have just loved this. I've just enjoyed it so much. Thank you so much for sharing your life and sharing so much of your insights, and just appreciate you being on the show so much.
Thank you, Rick. It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
If there's a show you've missed, you can go to my website, rickaltizer.com, and catch up. Or you can listen to my podcast in iTunes or wherever you hear your podcasts. Just search for The Rick Altizer Show. Altizer is spelled Altizer. I want to thank you for listening. Hey, would you tell a friend about this show and share the love? Be sure to check us out again next week as we discuss how we communicate the gospel through media to our culture. Let's be clear so the world can hear. I'll talk to you next week. Thanks for listening.
Jesus, there is this.